Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 126 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. This week we're talking with author and veteran blogger Glenn Reynolds, the man behind Instapundit.com. Glenn's new book is The Social Media Upheaval. It's going to make you think twice before sending out your next tweet. It's a critical read for parents of teenagers. Oh, heaven help them. I'm going to be one of those pretty soon. But it's also good for anyone who thinks social media is rewiring the culture. Spoiler alert, it is. You know, Quentin Tarantino is back this weekend, and his new film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, should dominate the box office so this week, maybe even next week, too. There's more at stake, though, than dollars and cents. For starters, the film is under attack because it doesn't give co-star Margot Robbie enough lines. Yes, the director who delivered Beatrix Kiddo and Jackie Brown, two of the most empowered heroines we've seen in the modern age, must be punished for making his new film too brotastic. It's exhausting, isn't it? The New York Post's resident social justice warrior, Sarah Stewart, tees up that lame attack too. But she also brings in some other issues to this debate, and I have to say, I think she's got a point. She mentions how closely Tarantino worked with Harvey Weinstein for years and years. How Tarantino bullied Uma Thurman into doing a stunt that later left her with permanent damage. And also the director's repugnant take on Roman Polanski drugging and raping a 13-year-old. To be fair, Tarantino later clarified his comments, but you know how that works. Now, Stewart is drawing some blood with her comments, but what happens? What is this going to do? Well, probably not much. Tarantino remains one of the Hollywood's most powerful players. Just look at all the hullabaloo surrounding his new movie. His career is just fine, and there's going to be lots of mourning if his next film, his 10th, is his last, like he's been threatening for quite some time. This controversy is not going to dent or ding or even scratch his career. Why? Well, we're so busy constructing fake outrages, we're immune to the real deal. I was one of the few critics who called out Tarantino months and months ago for not doing more to stop Harvey Weinstein. Now, Tarantino dated one of the producer's victims who told him about Weinstein's lechery. He also worked with another starlet who said similar things about Weinstein behind the scenes. Tarantino knew much, much more than a lot of his peers. And he was one fellow who could really withstand the blow to his career if he went full whistleblower. If he said what he wanted to say, shared what he wanted to share, you know, maybe it would cause a ruckus behind the scenes, but he's a huge star. He could have survived that, or maybe he could have just maybe tipped off some reporters and had them start the ball rolling. He stayed silent. He didn't say a word from what we can tell. So now cancel culture is attacking him for giving Margot Robbie too few lines of dialogue. Well, so what? Here's betting all of this new controversy is going to blow over the next few days, maybe even less time. That's how outrage culture works. In 48 hours, we've got to be outraged about something newer and shinier and more outrageous. And that's a shame, because the director really should be asked some tough questions about his actions away from the movie set. As it stands right now, he'll get a pass. And for what it's worth, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a very good film. It's much better than The Hateful Eight, his last feature, and it's certainly worth your time. It just recreates 1969 in ways that you just have to see and hear to believe. That part alone is well worth the price of admission. Now here's the tweet of the week. You know, Michael Moore is still clinging to the fragments of his formerly famous self. His movies no longer make big bucks like they once did, nor do they move the cultural needle an iota. We've moved on. I guess no one's told him that, though. But to be fair, the press adores him, quotes him constantly as a soothsayer, and he still thinks he can fuel the resistance with every other tweet of his. Case in point, this dire warning for the current commander-in-chief. Here we go. Hey, at Real Donald Trump, I'll be the first guest tonight on Seth Meyers' late night show on NBC. I'll have more exciting news for you. I'm even going to tell you exactly how you are going to be removed from the White House next year, if I can get the Dems on board. Grab a bucket of KFC and tune in. All right, did he just make a fat joke? Wow.
Hi, this is Rob Schneider. Now, I know these days that anyone with a pulse now has a podcast. So, the good news is, I have a pulse. The better news is, now I also have a podcast, just like everybody else. Except this is my podcast, so it's not like everybody else. But this podcast is titled See What Happens. Because we want to see what happens. See what happens? Which comes from a joke. And we'll play that right now for you. My mom was very controlling, truthfully. It was good, though, I guess, you know. The only thing I remember from my whole childhood thing, I remember most of my mom yelling at me. See what happens? You fell down. See what happens? You're crying. See what happens? You hurt yourself. See what happens? You broke that. See what happens? See what happens? I remember one time we were playing basketball about 3 miles away from the house. Somebody twisted an ankle. All of a sudden you heard, see what happened? Dude, that's your mom on a mountain over there. See what happens? So that's where the title of that's where the See What Happens podcast comes from my mother saying during my whole childhood, see what happens? Now, people may think that they know me, like my wife, but until you really have like a podcast, you don't really know somebody until they're talking for like an hour once a week in your head, in your car, when you're driving, when you're downloading something, when you're flying. So that's the point. Maybe you get to know me a little bit, and we'll find out some stuff, and we'll have my friends on, my beautiful wife, Patricia Schneider, and then my good buddy, Jamie Lissow, will be on. We're going to see what happens, because that's the name of the show. See what happens? Because that's what life is. I think this whole experience is to see what happens. I'm Rob Schneider. This is my podcast.
This week I'm proud to open up the HitCast to another right-leaning author, David Vining. David's new book, Crystal Embers, may look like a fantasy novel teeming with noble knights and heroines, but it's much more than that, which the author explains very well in her upcoming conversation. A quick note, the sound quality here is going to be a little bit off. It's fine, it's good, you'll hear every word, but it isn't as crystal clear, I hope, as what I sound like right now. You can hear everything that he says, but I just wanted to make sure that you knew that this was a little subpar moving forward, and I think we've got all the technical snafus behind us at the HitCast. I'm going to cross my fingers. The tech gods are funny at times, but I think we're good to go from now, but this will be the last interview where it's a little bit less sharp than usual. But still, David's worth listening to, and I really hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, David, thank you for joining the show. You know, this is a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart, Star Trek. And I feel like in recent years, the enthusiasm for Star Trek has been maybe waning, maybe, looking at the box office grosses for the last movie. And I want to get your take on it, because we've got some more recent developments, the show Discovery, there's the new Picard show, and of course, the potential of a Quentin Tarantino Star Trek movie. So feel free to jump in any of those three topics. So what's your general take about where we are in Star Trek Nation at this point?
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up Star Trek. My dad would watch TNG in the original syndicated run, so that's kind of where I grew up. So I'm, I guess mid-range Trek. And when the reboot started, I felt no real animosity towards them. 2009, Into Darkness, and beyond. They were designed for mass audiences, which Star Trek has never been. It's always been, in the movie form, it's always been kind of the mid-range budgeted thing, pray we make our money back sort of studio gamble. But when Paramount decided to bring it back in the late 2000s, it was, we're going to make a bunch of money off of this. And, it's not, after Star Trek has been around for 700 hours, it's hard to tell what Star Trek actually is. But one thing it probably has never been has been like the big studio action adventure. So it was always new ground. I enjoyed them, especially Beyond. Beyond was the one that made the least amount of money. Third one, obviously, but it was the one that embraced fun most while was cleanest narratively. Mm-hmm. The first one's fun, but it's kind of a mess in terms of storytelling. The second one has like thematic issues, and it's structured really weird. Plus, you have all the like weird J.J. Abrams. I'm going to keep needless things secret for no reason. But then Beyond is just simply, we just wanted to make a fun Star Trek movie, and I think it works really well. But it's within that context of Star Trek as it's never really been before, which is this action adventure spectacular.
You make a good point. I think if they had dialed down the budget and even just the expectations, they could kind of be more exploratory. They could be more creative and just say, "Hey, these are the Star Trek themes as we see them. This isn't meant to be a huge blockbuster. We hope you enjoy it. We hope it makes a lot of money, but we're gonna, I think I think Hollywood is 0 to 60 at this point. Either you make a tiny micro indie, or you make a $300 million blockbuster. The in between stuff seems to get pushed aside,
which is really unfortunate, because you think back to the original 6, and the one that sticks out as the weirdest is Star Trek 4. It's Save the Whales. It went pure 80s environmentalism. But at the same time, it's just a fun little adventure. It didn't need to make $500 million to $1 billion just to break even. It needed to make like 80, in like 1980s dollars, which is not a low amount of money. But it was an attainable goal for a weird little movie. And these new Star Trek movies, they can't be weird little movies anymore. They have to appeal to the most amount of people possible.
So I'm sorry, where we stand on the Tarantino Star Trek? I feel like the reporting is a bit sketchy. I don't know if he's committed. Is he just writing the script? Is he directing? What's the latest, or what's your sense of where the project is going? If it is.
I don't think he's decided yet. He's been really busy with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood trying to finish that up. Apparently he's still editing it after its premiere. But the most recent thing I saw was that, he needs to revisit the script and consider whether it's going to be his next. I kind of get the impression that he's not going to direct it. He's going to produce it, kind of be the hands-on producer. That would be my guess. But at the same time, he's talking about, horror and vulgarity. And Star Trek is 700 hours long. I can't really pinpoint what Star Trek is. Maybe it can be the sort of movie that Tarantino gravitates towards. If the choice is we either get more Star Trek Discovery or J.J. Abrams or nothing, well, if someone like Tarantino is going to come in and say, "Hey, I've got something different," why not? Just don't give him $250 million. give him 60 or 70. Then he'll be able to. It doesn't need to be that massive success.
Yeah, and the thing I'm worried about is the R rating seems odd in that Logan was R rated, and you sensed why. It was darker. The Wolverine story and character has always been had a edge to it, no pun intended. So that made sort of organic sense. But to tackle Star Trek and say, "Oh, it's going to be R," I would like to have the story first and the characters and the themes, and then if after that you think I need the R to tell my story, great. But and maybe it's a media manufactured thing, but just the fact that we even talk about the R, I don't get that. It just seems like a little bit of like a detour that we don't need.
Well, I mean, we all know what kind of R it will be. It will be driven by vulgarity and probably gore. But at the same time, it's do we need another sterile environment? Sort of Star Trek Voyager type thing. One of the things that excites me that there are a few franchises out there where studios have the ability to just use brand name recognition and tell weird stories. None of them are doing it.
Yeah.
Warner Brothers has Harry Potter. They're failing miserably. Disney has Star Wars; they're failing miserably. Paramount could do something like smaller and weirder with Star Trek, and if you have someone as strong with such a strong voice as Quentin Tarantino and such clout, then he could potentially take Star Trek in a weird new direction. And maybe, maybe there are valid stories to tell within the Star Trek universe that's filled with vulgarity and full of gore. And because I kind of implicitly trust artists, like real filmmakers, of which I consider Tarantino one. I know there's disagreement about that, but I do consider Tarantino like an actual, like real talented filmmaker. If he's got a weird little story to tell in Star Trek, I want to see it.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be another The Next Generation clone.
But I don't want to muddy the field here by bringing it a separate franchise, but I'd kill to see a James Bond directed and written by Quentin Tarantino. I think that would be maybe a more natural switch for him. But I agree, if you've got these brands and you've got these artists who have singular voices, that would be such an interesting way to kind of push things in new directions. But again, Hollywood is really risk averse. And so that's not going to be very common. It's just that with Tarantino, if he says something, it happens if he wants it to make it happen. And finally, after all this, if the no Star Trek with Tarantino evolves, that would be kind of a disappointment because I think everyone's kind of been curious about it. One last Trek question, and this is sort of a putting your finger on the pulse of the country, if not the world. Do you think that the Star Trek brand still excites people? Is there still enthusiasm there, or does it need a kind of a boost of some kind?
Well, I mean, if you think back to the history of Star Trek, its height was probably when The Next Generation was in its original run. Mm-hmm. And so that was probably when it excited the most people. And even then, it was a show in syndication. It was getting like 30 million viewers, which was high, especially for the time, especially compared to now. But that's still, not that. I don't think it was ever as big as some of the like bigger budget movies, which is why, Batman could do huge numbers, and then in the same year, Star Trek V could come out and just bomb terribly because it never really excited the mass audiences that much. But then, J.J. Abrams, he had the mandate from Paramount of make this mass appealable, and he did, and he turned Star Trek into a generic sci-fi adventure series, and that was probably its second peak in terms of popularity. And so, but even then, it wasn't that big. It was kind of big. It was big enough to get a couple of sequels out of it. It's the secret around Star Trek is that it's never been mass appealable, and the desire to make it mass appealable kind of undermines a lot of what people who really love Star Trek love about it, while not really appealing that well to mass audiences. So they're trying to straddle a line, and they're losing one part of the audience, which is the diehard Trekkies, while only sort of gaining the mass audiences. I compare it to New Coke in my mind. If you... I went through business school, and New Coke was a case study in what not to do. And it was, they did surveys from Coke drinkers, and the most loyal Coke drinkers said, "No, we hate New Coke," and yet Coke did it anyway because they figured that they would be able to get Pepsi drinkers. Yeah, and it didn't work.
New Coke was a lousy product, but a great metaphor for the last 20, 30 years. So I talked to someone else recently, someone else evoked New Coke as well. So it's kind of funny. Before we let you go, I had a kind of a selfish reason for inviting you. I know you've got a new book that's coming out very soon. So if not, it's actually out right now. Tell me a little bit about it, because you teased it to me offline. It sounds engaging. It sounds like a great use of science fiction or fantasy, and kind of where it tells a great story, but also makes you think on a certain level. So dig a little deeper into your book and tell us more about it.
Sure. My book is titled Crystal Embers. It's set in a fantasy universe that I call Course Day. And it's set at the very end of a sectarian civil war that has torn apart the country. It's between the secular loyalists and the religious faction. And our main character, our male main character, is a knight on the loyalist secular side, and he wins the war with one final stroke in one final battle. And he is celebrated, but then he has to go home. So this is a man who hasn't been home for 6 whole years. And when he goes home, he finds out that he has a wife that he's almost completely forgotten about. And his wife is mourning from the loss of their child, who died mere weeks before. So these two people who are technically married but are complete strangers are suddenly thrust together. But what defined their lives for the past few years is suddenly gone. Mm-hmm. The man, his name is George. His life was war. That's all he knew for the past 6 years. And war is over. So now he has to go back and become a farmer again. The woman was a mother, and she ran the farm. While her name is Virginia. She did this while the man was off to war. So she suddenly can't run the farm anymore because George is back and her son has died. So she has nothing. So these two people who don't know each other, had nothing in their own minds, are suddenly thrust together. Mm-hmm. And as they're just beginning to learn who the other person is and who they are without their core, something awesome happens. It's a fantasy world, so there are dragons, and their foreman on the property has burned a bunch of diseased wheat. And as this crop is burning, a dragon comes and lays on it and, kind of soaks up its warmth. And no one's willing to fight it. But George and Virginia discover this thing. And suddenly they have something big, something meaningful in their lives to fill them with. And they end up chasing it across the countryside. And I just saw it. I conceived of this book many years ago. And it was really just this idea of, if you have nothing in your life, will you end up following anything? Mm-hmm. And so constantly through the book, people are saying it's just an animal. It's just a really dangerous animal. You're crazy. But they just decide to pursue it.
Gotcha.
And, I'm not going to give everything, but it's the thrust of the story.
Excellent. Well, people can go to HollywoodInToto.com and find the links to the book and also a little bit more information about you. David, thanks so much for joining the HitCast. And by the way, we may check in with you again for different pop culture subjects. I know you got your finger on the pulse of that community, and I love to have different voices there. Can't just be me prattling on every week, but I want to have new and different voices there as well. Thanks so much. Good luck with the book, and I hope you'll be starting a new one soon.
Thank you very much. I'm always writing.
Don't touch that dial. You're listening to my daddy's podcast.
Can I confess a secret? There's one website I visit the first thing in the morning and right before bedtime. It doesn't have the words drudge or report in the title, mind you. I also check this site during the day a lot. The site is instapundit.com, run by veteran blogger Glenn Reynolds. If you haven't visited Instapundit, just know it's a constantly updated roundup of the best conservative news stories out there. But just be careful. The site can be addicting. Now, when Glenn isn't working on Instapundit, he's also writing thoughtful books like An Army of Davids, How Markets and Technology Empower Ordinary People to Beat Big Media, Big Government, and Other Goliaths. It was written a couple of years ago, but boy, that sounds pretty darn pertinent right now. His latest book, The Social Media Upheaval, examines the impact Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other sites are having on the culture at large. He's done his homework, and some of the passages are pretty frightening. Still, there's glimmers of hope here too, but you'll want to read all of it to get the full scope of the subject and what the possible solutions are. Here's my chat with Glenn Reynolds. Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, hi. How's it going?
Good, how are you?
I'm excellent. Yeah, for some reason there's two different feeds coming in, but I think we've kind of coalesced them into one.
Cool.
Excellent. All right. Before we begin, just a quickie. Can you give me a testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Just want to make sure the level is all right.
Sure. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Perfecto. All right. Well, we're going to jump right in. I'm going to be recording the introduction separately, so we're not going to worry about that. And I want to just quickly read you my plug at the end to make sure we're kind of both on the right page, and I don't want to leave anything out. So hang on one second here. So I'm going to say thanks again, Glenn, for joining the HiTcast. The new book is The Social Media Upheaval, a must-buy for parents of teens or just anyone worried about the culture in our digital age. And, of course, visit the site I visit at least a half dozen times a day, instapundit.com. Is that good?
Read it again.
Sure.
You're a little fast for me.
That's okay. I said thanks again, Glenn, for joining the HiTcast. The new book is The Social Media Upheaval, a must-buy for parents of teens or just anyone worried about the culture in our digital age. And, of course, visit the site I visit a half dozen times a day, instapundit.com.
That's perfect. Yeah,
Great.
Absolutely.
All right. We are all set. And thanks again. I actually read it more than that, but I don't want to embarrass myself for checking it out too often. But.
Well, I got to say, I really have been a big fan of your work for a long time. It's nice to actually get to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. We are all set. Any quick questions for me before we start?
No, I think we're good.
Great. All right.
Just be sure you send me a link when it's up so I can link to it.
Will do. Well, Glenn, on paper, Americans have more access to information than ever before. We can consume it faster than ever before. But as your book explains, we're not getting smarter as a result. Can you talk a little bit about that from the social media perspective, how we're getting dumbed down, and it's often with our own cooperation, really?
Oh, it really is, and it makes me sad. I wrote a piece when I used to write a column for the old Tech Central station site over 15 years ago. It was like 2002 or 2003, about how ubiquitous internet access everywhere meant that no matter where we went, we had the access to the sum total of human knowledge. And if you wondered about the hepthalite Huns or the rocket equation, the answer was at your fingertips, and this would have to make us smarter. Well, I blew that one. There's even a cartoon about it now that says, I have a device in my pocket that gives me access to the sum total of human knowledge. I use it to look at pictures of cats and argue with strangers. That's unfortunately more accurate than my prediction. There's a couple of reasons for that. But the biggest reason in the social media world is the systems are designed to manipulate you into arguing with strangers and looking at cats rather than actually thinking or learning. All of these social media sites use algorithms that are designed to promote what they call engagement. And engagement basically means an emotional response that will keep you on the site. And Jaron Lanier, who's sort of an old Silicon Valley guy, has a book on this out where he says, look, the easiest emotions to amplify are the negative emotions, basically anger, fear, hatred, and sadness. And that's, in fact, the longer you stay on social media sites, the research even indicates the angrier and sadder you're more likely to be. And that's not by accident. That's not because of some, bizarre characteristic of the human condition. That's because the systems are designed to make you that way because it makes them more money.
Even the term engagement sounds warm and fuzzy, but it really is deceptive in that way.
Yeah, I mean, in the old days of the internet, we still had some engagement. Another old cartoon is the guy who won't come to bed because he says someone is wrong on the internet. But now the systems are designed to take advantage of that and to, in fact, amplify it and manipulate it. And I think that's the striking part of the whole thing. I just think that they do a lot of damage. And there's sort of two levels of problems with social media. One is that one, and that even if they were politically neutral, even if the people who ran Google and Facebook and so on were across the political spectrum or just totally apolitical, the stuff they did would still be toxic and pernicious for a lot of reasons. On top of that is another layer, which is that they are a very non-diverse group of very far-left people who see it as their duty, privilege, and obligation to steer society to the far left whenever and however they can through means fair and foul. So you saw today, I don't know, a Google executive admitted that they, in fact, manipulate Trump presidential searches to make Trump look bad. Facebook did a lot of experiments with manipulating its users' emotional state and seeing if that affected their likelihood to go vote. It's easy to imagine that being abused in an election setting. something Jaron Lanier also writes about. And I think that, so it's both a bad platform and bad people, and the combination is bad times two.
Yeah. I think a couple of years ago, I'd hear some conservatives complaining about these social media platforms, and I'm not a conspiracy guy, and I really dismiss them. And then, we look at, fast forward to today, it's almost impossible not to accept the reality. Are there things that people who are right of center or just interested in fairness can do? I mean, I feel helpless in the situation right now that there's something that has to happen. We'll get to that in a minute, but on a more personal level, is there anything we can do about this right now?
Well, I quit Twitter, and I have to say it's the best thing I ever did. People are always saying, "Do you miss Twitter?" Or some people are like, "Please come back to Twitter." And I'm like, I never miss Twitter. Not one day goes by when I say, "I wish I were still on Twitter." Mm-hmm. And I'm happier and more relaxed, and I feel like I'm just as well informed as I ever was. And I've saved a lot of screen time during the day and a lot of emotional energy. And you think when you're on Twitter that you're part of the dialogue, shaping this. Every once in a while, maybe you have an impact, but most of the time, it's just a bunch of people yelling at each other. Mm-hmm. It is unfortunate. And actually, David French had a column about this. He's totally right. He says the unfortunate thing is you get off Twitter, your life gets better, but Twitter actually gets slightly crazier as the saner people get off. And worse yet, if you look at who is very engaged on Twitter, there's a lot of blue check people who are really responsible for setting the national debate and dialogue and everything who are on there all the time. And in some sense, that's useful because they reveal that they are much less measured and much less intelligent and generally much nastier than their official public persona otherwise. But on the other hand, I think they also egg each other on into being crazier. I think that one of the biggest flaws in our society as a whole right now is the people who run our institutions are not so much focused on running the institutions well as on performing for their peers. So it doesn't matter if you run a company badly as long as you say and do the right social justice-y woke things, as long as you hold the right politics. It doesn't matter if you're a bad reporter as long as you have the right attitudes, and so on. And I think that Twitter actually gives people a stage in which to act that out more, and I think that adds to the destructiveness of a already destructive trend.
Yeah, you hinted at this. I'm always surprised that some of the nastiest comments are from the blue check types, which I'm just kind of staggered by that. I'm thinking, you have a platform, your name is out there, you're known. Do you realize that, hey, is this mic on? It's on, and the whole world is seeing it.
Well,
go ahead.
It's totally unselfconscious, and it's hilarious. I mean, you may recall we had a scandal, gosh, it's been about 10 years now, the so-called Journo List scandal, which was a secret email list run by Ezra Klein that journalists could get on and essentially figure out what storylines they wanted to run to help the Democrats. And they made few bones about doing that. They saw themselves pretty clearly as basically just Democratic operatives with bylines. And when it came out, it was enough of a scandal that, the Washington Post fired some people. And some careers were briefly blighted, although since all the other lefty media people thought they had their hearts in the right place, they were rehabilitated pretty fast. But on Twitter, they don't even have to have a secret email list. They just put this stuff out there, and everybody follows along. It's like at least 10 years ago, they were slightly ashamed. And now, no.
It's a sequel, Journalist to the Transparency, and I'm shocked by it as well. One of the things the social media people showed me, and it basically connected with me, is the lack of empathy that we see on social media. And from a personal perspective, there are people that I trust my children with. They're good people. And then I see them on Facebook, and I'm shocked by what they say. Talk about, just for people who haven't read the book yet, and to give a good tease, what's going on there from that perspective? Because that amazes me as well, that the empathy quotient is diminishing, and it's because of social media.
Yeah, and actually, my experience is people tend to behave better on Facebook than they do on Twitter because they're at least around people they know, and there's a little more context usually. But even there, yeah, you're right. I actually saw a female law professor who I shall not name today saying some pretty nasty and idiotic stuff about men on Facebook. And I was like, really? Really? That's what you really think? Or are you just performing for your female law professor friends so that you look woke? And I think probably the answer is that's what's going on. But people don't even realize that's what they're doing sometimes, you get revved up. One of the things that social media do is they make it easier to form a mob. Now, one characteristic of human beings is they like to form mobs. And the reason they like to form a mob is that you can feel powerful without facing any real responsibility. There's a lot of catharsis. There is a thrill in the anonymity that comes with being part of a mob. Even if you're not really anonymous, you've at least got other people to blame too, and so on. And people have always formed mobs as long as there have been enough people in one place to create a mob. And we usually thought that was pretty bad. But what social media have done is made it much easier to form a mob. You don't have to get your torches and pitchforks and persuade several hundred people to meet downtown in the public square now. You can get on Twitter and whistle up a mob in 20 minutes. And, as I think it was Stephen Hayward said, or maybe it was John Hayward. I always get my Haywards confused. Says, basically, we've subsidized the creation of mobs. And when you subsidize something, you get more of it.
Yeah, Frankenstein's monster could have walked away free. He just didn't have to sign on Twitter. When you think about the possible fixes for this, and you explore this in the book, regulation comes up, and there are often lots of strings attached to that. Can you give one example of a regulation fix and explain why it could be even worse than what we have right now?
Well, one of the things that's been proposed is the abolition of Section 230 immunity from the Communications Decency Act. And what Section 230 does, it says if you're an information provider, like, say, Facebook, you're not responsible for anything on your site that comes from somewhere else. So this was originally designed so that newspapers could have comment sections without being sued for libel for what people said in them, or intellectual property violation if people posted a photo that didn't belong, and so on. And it was designed to let newspapers have those and edit them without being treated as a publisher. That's fine, but social media businesses like Twitter and Facebook literally couldn't exist without Section 230.
Yeah.
They'd be sued out of existence overnight without that kind of immunity. I think because of that, I think that's kind of a too big a hammer even for me, and I'm a bigger hammer kind of guy. Another proposal you get a lot is to get rid of anonymity and require people to use their true names on the internet. Now, as it happens, there's actually an old science fiction story about this by Werner Veggie called True Names, in which basically people are required to use their true identity when they're on the internet. And it doesn't turn out well in the story. It's a dystopian story. So I don't think that's a good way to go. Lefties, because they like to bully and mob people, are now against that kind of anonymity because they want you to have to reveal yourself so they can go to your boss and try to bully them into firing you. It was different back when it was communists who were being fired. Then they were all in favor of privacy. So that's another bad idea, I think. And any kind of speech regulation based on the content of what people say, regulations on hate speech or whatever, which is a legally meaningless term, is going to violate the First Amendment and be a terrible idea anyway. Yeah. That's why my proposal is, in fact, something simpler and content neutral, which is antitrust enforcement. And there's two paths for antitrust enforcement, both of which are important. One is against collusion. It is against the law for companies to collude with each other to exclude competitors. And yet the big tech companies are found doing that all the time.
I saw James O'Keefe had an expose a week or two ago, maybe more, and multiple platforms shut him down almost back to back.
Yes, well, sort of proving his point, right? So Google owns YouTube, which drops him. Then Vimeo, which is a competitor of YouTube, but much smaller, basically decides that it doesn't want to fight with Google, so they kick him off too. The only place left where he was available besides his own site was a service called BitChute. Now, BitChute was created as a competitor to YouTube, and then PayPal, as a courtesy to Google, cut BitChute off from receiving payments. So that's an example of the kind of thing that happens. Likewise, Gab, which is a competitor to Twitter, was cut off from receiving PayPal payments.
This almost sounds like an Onion headline, but this is all happening in real time.
Yes, this is all real.
And by the way, the Vimeo example, I remember I saw that YouTube yanked O'Keefe's video, and my first thought was, well, Vimeo's smaller, but they're still out there. They could, oh no. Before I could complete my thought, they kind of folded. I just was shocked by that. So, instead of Ted Cruz's,
that's one kind of it.
Go ahead,
so that's one kind of antitrust enforcement. Collusion is easy to police. People have to talk. then the other kind is really just to break some of these companies up. I mean, I remember when there was a big Facebook privacy breach a while back, and some of my Facebook friends were saying, well, screw this, I'm getting off Facebook. I'm going to go to Instagram. And, of course, then people would point out to them, Facebook actually owns Instagram, So, I mean, it's really hard to escape. And if you look at some fields like advertising, I mean, Google has advertising so thoroughly cornered that it is effectively a monopoly. It controls the entire market. My colleague at the University of Tennessee, Maurice Stuckey, who, unlike me, is a serious antitrust scholar, has written a couple of books on this and the way to treat dataopolies, as he calls them. And, it's clearly called for at this point and well within the norms of traditional antitrust law.
I think Senator Ted Cruz has been talking about this aggressively of late. Are you optimistic there's a chance this could happen, or is this something that we talk about, suggested as a real solution, then it never happens?
No, I think it's going to happen, and I'll tell you why. The head of the antitrust division it was a little over 2 months ago, because it was just before I went to Stanford for the conference on social media, which was just about exactly 2 months ago. He gave a speech in which he basically set forth my arguments and said, yes, sometimes they're providing free services, but you can still be an antitrust violator even when you're giving things away for free, which, of course, we established back in the Microsoft case. And he said, when you abuse your power to keep new entrants out, when you purchase potential competitors to keep competition down, there are lots of antitrust violations there that need to be policed, and we're going to be looking at them very closely. And more recently, Bill Barr, the Attorney General, has basically said the same thing. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some real interest in it. Now, it's hard. Big antitrust cases are slow, and I'm sure that what Google, et cetera, are going to do is they're going to do their best to beat Trump, which they would do anyway, because they figure nothing really bad can happen to them unless there's more than the next year and a half to make it happen. Although they're at grave risk anyway, because I went to this Stanford Free Speech and Social Media Conference, which was very well done. Michael McConnell did it there, and it had a very broad range of ideologies. And everybody there, from left to right, was saying we should hit these companies with antitrust. I've almost never seen anything like it. I've literally never seen anything like it where my own ideas are concerned. Coming back on the plane, I was sort of freaked out, like, I've never been somewhere where everybody agreed with me like that. What's wrong with me? What have I missed? But really, I think if they think that by getting rid of Trump and getting a Democrat in, they're necessarily going to escape antitrust regulation, I think they may be disappointed. Some Democrats, of course, will play ball a lot better with them than others.
What I'm seeing about all of this, and it's all documented as far as the bias and the situation of James O'Keefe, the media is either deadly silent or they're spinning on behalf of the tech companies. Can that change? Will that change? Or will it take someone maybe left of center, like a high profile, like a Rachel Maddow, getting banned or getting treated badly until they realize, hey, this is a story. It's pretty important. It affects the culture. It affects everything. Where are they? Where are the reporters? Are there any honest folk out there who want to cover the story? Because it's all right of center, and it shouldn't be. It should be across the board.
Not very many, and if they are, their bosses probably don't want them to. It's interesting. In fact, I talked to Harmeet Dillon, who's the lawyer who is she was representing James Damore, and she's representing a bunch of people who are suing Google now for being fired for being conservative. And she said, I am like the only plaintiff's lawyer in California who's even willing to sue Google. Everybody else is just too afraid. So I think that in the media world, Google has that's plaintiffs' lawyers. They're not easy to scare. In the media world, Google has such a big footprint and so much power over ads and so many subtle ways to screw your platform without you even knowing that I think a lot of places are just afraid to cross them.
That's interesting. It's almost like Variety and The Hollywood Reporter. They didn't cover Weinstein's case because, in part, they didn't want to cut off their ties to this massive producer who could grant them interviews or not. Glenn, before we wrap, you talked about quitting Twitter and how much better you feel, and I'm a little bit jealous right now. Can you have maybe some other general tips, either for parents or just people who are online who, things are not going to get better overnight? We've discussed a lot of significant problems, but is there anything you can do to make life a little easier in our digital age?
I think the single biggest thing is to keep your mental and emotional distance. I mean, one of the problems you have when you're on Twitter, and this is true with any social media to some degrees, the problems of the world start to feel like your problems. You start to feel like you're invested in this, and like you have some responsibility to make sure it comes out right. And if it's wrong, it directly affects you. And to quote my sister talking about something else, she said, it's a tragedy, but it's not our tragedy. And there's a lot of stuff like that on social media. It's a problem, but it's not your problem. Don't make it your problem.
Interesting, yeah, and I think we all tend to do that, and we all think we have the power to change things, but that's a little bit of an illusion as well. Kind of like what happens on Twitter often stays on Twitter. But well, Glenn, thank you so much for joining the HiTcast. The new book is The Social Media Upheaval. It's a must-buy for parents of teens, but just anyone who's worried about the culture in our digital age. And of course, visit the site that I visit about a half dozen times a day, if not more, instapundit.com. It's one of the oldest sites that I've been visiting, and clearly one of the best, if not the best. Glenn, thank you so much, and good luck with the book.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out HollywoodandToto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at HollywoodandToto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.